Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library's Truman Forum. I'm Katie Stover, Director of Reader Services for the Kansas City Public Library. Tonight's event recognizes two luminaries in the world of poetry. Dr. Taylor Byas, the 2023 winner of the Maya Angelou Book Award and UMKC's Cock-a-Fair Visiting Writer in Residence for her debut collection of poetry, I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times. And Melissa Ferrer Civil, the inaugural Poet Laureate of Kansas City. The Maya Angelou Book Award was founded in 2020 to honor the legacy of Missouri-born author Maya Angelou. It is a collaboration between KCPL, Missouri State University, Northwest Missouri University, Southeast Missouri State University, Truman State University, UMKC's Carolyn Benton Cock-a-Fair Chair in Continuing Education, and University of Missouri at Columbia. The award recognizes contemporary authors whose work demonstrates a commitment to social justice and diversifies contemporary American literature. The Angelou Award recognizes works of poetry or fiction in alternating years. It is funded in part by the annual UMKC Creative Writing MFA program's Writers for Readers benefit. I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times is the third work to win the award and the second volume of poetry to do so. The library is giving away a limited number of copies. Please see me if you'd like one, because Taylor will be signing in the lobby afterwards. Our poets this evening, Taylor Byas and Melissa Ferrer Civil, had never met in person until today. Yet their work shares a bond. Taylor and Melissa approach their poetry from a place of love and learning. You'll not only hear it, you'll see it in the lively conversation both poets will share with you. In addition to being the current Maya Angelou Book Award winner, Dr. Taylor Byas holds a master's degree in English from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She has won numerous prizes for her poems, the Adrienne Rich Poetry Award, Frontier Poetry Award for New Poets, and the 2024 Honor Book for Best Poetry from ALA's Black Caucus. That's from my folks. Our city's first poet laureate, Melissa Ferrer Civil, is also a performer, organizer, and educator. Melissa is the founder of the Arts and Organizing event series, A Nation in Exile. She holds a BA in creative writing and Italian from Florida State University and a master's in education from Park University. Melissa is a Charlotte Street studio resident and a Chrysalis Institute alum. Please welcome Taylor Byas and Melissa Ferrer Civil.
Hey y'all, how y'all doing?
Hello.
Yeah, it's good to see these faces out here. I guess we just start a conversation.
Absolutely.
And y'all are gonna listen and hopefully enjoy it. Well, first, Taylor, I have to say, congratulations on winning the Maya Angelou Book Award.
Thank you so much.
My first question for you is, how has winning the award, but also publishing the book, changed your relationship to poetry, and then winning the award changing your relationship to the book itself?
Yeah. I think when you sort of put something out into the world, you put a book out into the world, there's a way that it's kind of not yours anymore. And you kind of have to be open to all of the ways that people are just going to meet the book when they find it. And I think, when you're sort of a baby writer or sort of in those earlier phases, we feel so attached to everything that we produce. And I think there's a certain modicum of control that we want to have and that we feel like we have over the work. And I think putting this book out into the world was a very good reminder that there's only so much control that you can have over the work. And I think it's encouraged me to kind of let go in a really, really, really productive way. I think also, publishing can be slow sometimes, y'all. We sold this book in 2021. And it is now in 2024, so we sold in 2021, which means most of the poems were written even before then. And so I think also sometimes the distance that kind of creates itself between, you and the work These are poems that are, now like over 3 years old in most cases. And it's so strange to be back in this book and to be spending so much time with these poems and to see the distance between the writer I am now and the writer that I was when I wrote these poems in a very bittersweet way. I think it's also been an opportunity for me to celebrate that old version of me in a very, very sweet way. But the book and my relationship to
Like winning the award.
winning the award, you just have, like, I had no expectations about, what this book was going to do in the world. It can be so easy, I think, to get kind of, swallowed up in just the industry sometimes. And I think maybe as a writer of color, I was worried that these poems or the story wasn't important enough to win something like this. Because I think sometimes we think about awards and we think about it, they have to be sort of stories that are kind of more obviously maybe speaking to society or more obviously speaking to present issues and things of that nature. So imagine my surprise, how bowled over I was to win this award and to know that people saw the value in the story about, a Black girl who kind of grew up in Chicago and is still trying to figure out her way around this world and seeing that was important enough to award and celebrate. It's been life-changing. It's been life-changing.
That makes me want to ask an impromptu question.
Yeah, of course.
Just something around how do I say this? How is it that, actually, we're going to stick to the script because I'm sure this will come up again and I'm losing the question.
Let's do it.
Can we talk about, because you already started talking about what your book is about,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Can we talk about the title of the book? Where did it come from? Your connection to it, everything?
Absolutely. So the title comes from my relationship with The Wiz. The Wiz has been a movie that is just really, I think, foundational for me, but also my family dynamics. It's a movie that we bonded over, that we watched kind of over and over again together. So it means a lot to me in a sort of just sentimental, familial way. But this book is also a lot about family. And I think that's a part of why The Wiz came up for me. And this book is a lot about what happens when you leave home. And I didn't start writing about Chicago, which is sort of home for me and the home that's central to this book. I didn't start writing about Chicago until I moved away from it. I moved to Birmingham for undergrad, and I started telling people I was from Chicago, and I got really strange reactions. People had lots of things to say about that, and then by extension, lots of ideas about who I was. And I think encountering and confronting other people's ideas about Chicago, and then, by extension, me, I then was forced to think about who Chicago was to me. And so I started to think about that. And then, of course, moved to Cincinnati as well, which is very different from Birmingham, but also, again, very different responses there. Like, a lot of people in Cincinnati have been to Chicago, have lived in Chicago, know Chicago. And so it's really fascinating to have those very different reactions from people, which then forced me to kind of mold my own understanding of what Chicago meant, which I think required distance. Yeah.
And what was it like coming to that understanding of how you saw Chicago? What was it like to wrestle with those concepts and those realities too?
Yeah, I think Chicago ended up becoming this bigger than life character in the process of thinking about what it was to me. Part of the project of this book, I think, is to show that Chicago is this complicated place and not the sort of monolithic, killing field or, place of violence that I think a lot of people imagine it to be. But in my own exploration of what it is, it became a parent. It became kind of a teacher. It was, it was has played all of these different roles. And so it kind of came to life in a way that I think I wasn't expecting.
Yes. So speaking of addressing Chicago and its realities, your book really reminded me of Wanda Coleman's American Sonnets. And specifically in the way that like Wanda Coleman uses the sonnet. The sonnet is a form with 14 lines. There's like the Shakespearean sonnet from, back then, Shakespeare times. And there's also the Petrarchan Italian sonnet. And like, for me, I was kind of like curious about your use of forms because you use so many, right? You use villanelles, pantoums. I was like labeling all the forms and I was like, she's just jumping through these forms. And I'm wondering about your relationship to the forms and also the history of the forms while talking about Black issues, because a lot of these forms come from like cultures that have like historically oppressed Black culture. So I'm just,
Yeah. I think when thinking about form and my relationship to it, I'm going all the way back to our dearest Phyllis Wheatley, who was writing about form, but also sort of like subverting form to talk about the various systems and institutions that were oppressing her, for example. And as you said, a lot of these forms are forms that are historically very white, historically very sort of Eurocentric, forms that don't really consider the sort of voices on the margins. And so for me, when writing in these forms, that's very sort of, disrupting the canon, right? To me, that's an important mission, I think, for me. And so populating those forms with, Blackness and just, the everyday experiences, writing a sonnet crown about just Chicago and just what it means to me to be from the South Side, that's the disruption of the canon for me. And I think also, form has always been, I think, these really wonderful containers. Sometimes you come to the page with so much, you don't really know what to do with it, and I think form is often this really productive container in which I can kind of sort things out. But the sonnet crown in particular, I think the South Side sonnet crown, which was originally just kind of one big sonnet crown, and ultimately we decided to break it up, right, for this book. But I think also sonnet crowns in particular just give you a very particular space to move around in. Like these are just kind of rooms that you get to spend time in. And all of them are connected, but you just kind of get to move through the house and kind of appreciate each room in the house. And that's kind of how I see sonnet crowns working and how I was able, I think, to really process or start to process what the South Side of Chicago meant to me. That was like one of the first poems that I wrote that started to think about Chicago.
Do you think it took, like, in speaking about like subversion and like basically taking up space, was there like a revving up for you that had to happen? Like, I know as a poet, I'm often like wanting to be like so honest on the page, but then find myself like towing around things. Like, what was that process like for you, just getting it out there?
Yeah, I love taking up space because I'm also thinking about sonnet crowns as doing that too. Like there's 7, and if you do the heroic, that's like 14, right? But, the sonnet crown itself takes up space, right, in a way too. But I think when it comes to being honest on the page, I think I struggle a little less with that. I think if there's anything that I struggle with being honest about, it's maybe more the personal things or the things that involve other people that I love. For example, a lot of this book deals with my dad, right? And the fact that he's an alcoholic, and my dad is very much, still alive and capable of reading the things that I write. And those were questions that I had to wrestle with in the beginning. Sort of, is the price that comes with this one that I'm willing to pay? And sort of, why am I putting this out here? And have I done my due diligence in casting, this person, my father in this particular instance, as the complicated human that he is, and not the sort of, Disney villain that we might be tempted to draw people as when they've harmed us. And I think those were just questions that I had to sit with.
I'm really curious as to how you gave yourself permission, like after asking yourself those questions.
I have a really wonderful mom who's very supportive, and in one of our many conversations about these things, because I think she also kind of hit a point of frustration, because her thing was, well, this is in the past, and you said you're forgiven, and so this conversation should be over. And I was kind of like, forgiveness doesn't necessarily equal forgetting. Forgiveness doesn't mean the conversation stops. And I told my mom, I said, you know what? there's our family dynamic and everything that happened. And if that was a building, right, me, my mom, and my dad, we are all standing at different parts of the street, looking at the same building, and we're all seeing it from a different perspective, even though we're looking at the same thing. And so even though my dad's over there and he might see a window that I'm not seeing, and I might be, seeing this door in a way that he's not seeing, what we're seeing doesn't cancel out the other. And I think I had to keep remembering that as like my experience doesn't necessarily invalidate what is going on with them, and their experience doesn't cancel out my truth either. And I think returning to that always sort of empowers me to keep telling my truth.
And have you found that many people resonate with the truth that you share?
That's the rewarding part. Like, that's the gift, right?
Yeah.
Is in sharing this book and having the opportunity to share this book and travel places and meet people who have, read these poems. I also meet people who have needed these poems and who have been gracious enough to share that with me. And that's also what keeps me going. Is I think that's one of the reasons why we're doing what we do, right? We're trying to build a bridge between ourselves and others. I think that's what all literature is attempting to do is connect with other people. That's kind of why we show up to the page. And so I absolutely do think people have come to the book and have found things that they've needed, and that is a gift.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So sometimes while writing a poem,
Yes.
I stumble into talking about coming to the page, right?
Yes.
I stumble into a certain knowing or a certain surprising truth or something that just feels true in my guts that I didn't know was inside of me. Did that happen for you while writing any of these poems, and what were some of them, if you care to share?
Oh, that happens all the time. It happens more lately because I think the way that I approach poems or the way that I come to the page is much less concerned about having a set idea of, I know where this thing is going to go. I've kind of, in the practice of just giving myself over to what the poem is asking of me, and I think I'm always kind of surprised in that way. But I think the most surprising poem for me was probably the last poem in the book. It was the last poem that I wrote for the book. And I think it was surprising because we were putting together this book. I had all these ideas about, this is what the book is about. It's about home, it's about family, it's about, alcoholism and the journey of Black womanhood. And eventually it kind of hit me. I was like, oh, this is also just like a book about love and figuring out how to love myself again. And that's kind of where Dear Moon, the last poem in the book, kind of comes from. And I feel like sometimes you're reading a book or a collection and you encounter a poem that feels like a sort of thesis or like, oh yes, this is what it is. Yeah. And that poem is definitely that for me. It was a really beautiful thing to kind of, for that to hit me and for me to kind of be able to write that poem and have it at the end of the book.
Yeah. Do you think that you stumbled on, because you said you don't come to the page with ideas, right? Which actually is kind of hard for me to listen to because sometimes I'm like, I got this thing and I'm gonna say it.
You feel called out, I'm sorry.
But it's fine, it's cool. Do you think you came to new ideas about Chicago through the poetry?
Ooh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think in the remembering, memory is weird. Memory is slippery in there. I think every time you return to a memory, the integrity of it is shaken because you're finding new things all the time. Mm-hmm. And if you return to a memory and you're finding new things all the time, it's like, well, what was the memory to begin with? Which is really interesting, but it's also fascinating to do that. Mm-hmm. And so I think in being forced to remember Chicago, I was always kind of discovering it anew, which was so fascinating to me. And I think I discovered a new feeling of tenderness for it in being away from it. I'll never move back.
Okay.
To be clear. I can't do the winters.
Yeah.
But I definitely feel a different tenderness than I did sort of when I first left.
Yeah, now I'm really curious. Though you say you'll never move back, have you been back since?
Oh, I'm back all the time.
Okay,
yes.
And has that changed your relationship with the reality of Chicago?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think now, when I moved away, Chicago was kind of like, it was the shiny emerald city that I think I like maybe was trying to return to in some ways, and I think the Emerald City was also, you know, this very amorphous thing that I think I had to find that had all the answers, and then you figure out like, you know, that's not real, right? But yeah, I think now that, you know, my parents have kind of gone through their divorce, and there's just a lot of painful, I think, realities that sort of populate and live in that space for me now. It's lost its luster in some ways, but I think just like the fantasy of it is gone. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I just think I have a more realistic relationship with it, which is, you know, in turn, I think more complex. It has more room for all of the sort of different compartments of things that live there now, which is, you know, on the one hand, all of these painful family histories, but on the other hand, all of these really fond ways that I've been remembering it in my childhood and those sorts of things. So I think it's expanded, like, my space where my feelings for Chicago was. It just have expanded to allow more.
That's amazing. Okay. So I've written down some themes that I found in your collection. You've already touched on a lot of them.
Yeah.
But I'll just like repeat some of them. So there's home and transition. There's the self and the self given over, innocence, the loss of innocence, and the reclaiming of innocence, relationships, generational trauma, violence, beauty, tragedy, love. Honestly, like, there's more. I know there's more. Because it's such a dense and packed and amazing and like expansive book. It's so great. I think my favorite poem in this book is actually Blackberrying, for the ways that it foreshadows the content and complexities to follow in the rest of the text. What are some of your favorite poems in the book? Two, how do they relate to the grander themes, either ones that I've named,
Sure.
or ones that you identify with?
Sure.
And then three, will you read some for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've sort of named Blackberrying, and I think you're absolutely right. This poem, you know, it's about sort of Black childhood. It sort of touches on that innocence, loss of innocence that you're thinking about, and the ways that I think Black children are just forced to kind of grow up and forced to be aware of realities that, you know, we wish that they didn't have to be, but sadly, that's kind of a part of the journey. So I will go ahead and read Blackberry, and it's after Sylvia Plath, and it also has an epigraph: Blacker the berry, sweeter the juice, Edmonia Henderson, Black Man Blues. Children in the yard, and nothing but blackberries. Blackberries culled from the waist-high bushes, the blister bumps smashed down to seed and muck, then handprints on white button-downs and knee-highs. Blackberries pricked by thumbnail, an accidental murder, my own miscalculation of what the black skin could endure. Blackberries slit, then quickly squished, burying down the sides of my fingers, wet splints for the joints. I could not tell if my mother's side requiem was for the fruit or my ruined clothes. Perhaps she lamented the deep red stain on my hands, mistaken for the first sample of womanhood. The next week, children exhausting from school buses, flocking to the bushes in the yards to blackberry again. Us little Black girls crowning our fingers, blackberries for acrylic nails, for cat claws. The little Black boys lugging the white plugs from the fruit's center like grenade pins, throwing them across the yard before diving headfirst into grass. We could only fight temptation for so long. We grind the berries in our palms again, let the juice tattoo new veins down to elbow pit, lap up the pulp with our tongues. We paint our faces berry black, the careless dashes like freedom papers, releasing us from something we don't yet understand. The evenings always end in taste, the sweet syrup drying like blood on our lips.
Oh.
Yeah. That's one of the earliest poems, probably one of the oldest poems in this book, too. I think that one was written while I was still in Birmingham, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah. I think another one that's central, Drunken Monologue from an alcoholic father's oldest daughter. So, with my father being an alcoholic, I think there's a very particular way as the oldest daughter that I had to exist within our family dynamic. I think when you have a parent who is, unable to kind of fill their role for whatever reason, there's a way that sometimes that oldest daughter has to then become a sort of mother figure, both to younger siblings, and then oddly enough, like mothering the parents sometimes too, so there's a way that the mothering is sort of going in both directions. And I think as a result, some of the childhood, the innocence again kind of gets taken away and kind of gets robbed and stolen in some of those ways. And so I think I hit a point where I was just like so frustrated, so angry, and I was trying to figure out like, why does he keep making these decisions? Why is he choosing this over just family? Like what is it? And in sort of needing a space to spiral, I wrote a Sistina. And if any of y'all are familiar with Sistinas, she's a long girl. She's like 39 lines. she has a lot of space. Her stanzas are like 6 lines each. They're pretty dense. But it gave me the space that I needed to get this poem written, because I had tried and failed so many times. And so this is Drunken Monologue from an alcoholic father's oldest daughter. My friends say I should have been a therapist, and it ain't funny no more. I ain't seen $1 of pay for this labor, all my pretending. Who do I see about my check? My father says, I just need somebody to talk to when he calls. He's sitting in our house alone, looking at old pictures and drinking. I still love my wife, and if I answer the phone, I gotta be the mother he missed out on as a kid. I pick up and I gotta turn on a mother's softness, but I ain't gave birth to nothing. Never felt that funny feeling of my second self latching on to the first. How do you love something that looks right through you? You gotta pretend, act like you understand. My father says, I spent Christmas alone for the first time in my life, and man, I swear somebody needs to give me an Oscar for the way I sounded like somebody's mama. Said, God gonna work it out. But I know my mother did the right thing, left him. My brother and sister were alone with him for hours while she was gone, and I just felt funny about it. And the way my father would call me pretending he was the victim when I knew what it really was. Maybe we all loved the chaos a little bit, having a place to put the blame. Maybe I loved the way they needed me, but I ain't loved the pressure. Somebody told me I was the glue that held it all together. Now I gotta pretend that's a compliment. I gotta ha-ha and he when they call me Mother 2.0. I laugh and say I don't even need kids anymore, but what's so funny about that? A hatred that spreads to the womb. I've had a lot of alone time to wonder about the choices my father makes, being alone, over rehab, over family. Sometimes I say, that motherfucker don't love me to myself in the mirror real tough. And I keep saying it until it's funny, until I'm laughing, and then I'm crying, and then I sound like somebody dying when I start coughing from both. Sometimes I ask my mother what happened to him, and she just says, it's sad. Most times I pretend I feel the same and I on the phone, but this time I can't pretend no more. I say, Mama, I know you feel bad for leaving him alone, but it was the right thing to do. I say you did what any mother would have done. I say the kids know you did it out of love to protect them. She's silent, so I say, Mama, he could have killed somebody. And she says, hardy ha, real funny, but just how funny if we ain't laughing. I want to say something in the silence, something funny, but I know my mother wants to be left alone when she pretends to yawn, so I tell her I love her, and I don't remember who hangs up. somebody. And then the last poem, which I think is kind of, again, I mentioned earlier, this epiphany about, the book being about love, and the book that sort of smacked me in the face in thinking about this book. I'll read the last poem. So this is Dear Moon. When the dark curtains for the bedroom came, I blacked you out like the night you fight in. Forgive me, but I'm still working through it in therapy. Lately, I've been so sudden with my decisions. Cut my braids out of my head a month early, put a deadline on a man's love. I'm leaving space for nothing but blame in the new season, and this here is no different. I never told you about the great hurt between us. Me, 13 and thinking I needed you to speak back to me. Back then, I skipped my wishes to you like stones over water. I slept in the overhang of mornings that relieved your shift. I'm angry, I still don't know what to call the thing between us. Were you friend or sister, the first lover to leave when I became too much? I've surrendered to the half-truth. Men remind me of you. The mixed messages, you in my bed every night and nothing ever to say of it. My therapist says I'm projecting, but goes silent when I mention that you've been doing it to me my whole life. At night, I get moody and waiting, anxious for you to ask me how I've been, anxious enough to pay someone to ask me now instead. The harder and fuller truth, men have abandoned me and I never heard from you. I was a shadow of a wolf, whimpering into your blank light. I didn't know that love was an ancestor of quietude, that you were still there. Of all things love, I'm still learning. Thank you.
So, something that I noticed in this book, I'm so happy you read that last poem, was because, so the first line you start with is, "This is what teaches me to know." Yeah. And then the last line of this book is, "Of all things love, I'm still learning." Yeah. And one, I want to know if that was very intentional, because it feels very intentional. And then two, just, I think this is more of a philosophical question, if you're okay with it.
Okay, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you think that this process of life and this process of writing is a continual learning process of love? And is that something that you uncovered in this? And where are you in this process, if that's okay for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So about being intentional kind of with the, the first line of the book, "This is what teaches me love," and "Of all things love, I'm still learning." I definitely, when I realized that book, or when I was writing that poem, I was like, this is the end poem, like this is it. And I knew that was a note that I wanted to return to. So I was very intentional. I knew I wanted to end on love. I didn't know what that looked like until I was kind of in the poem. But sort of the sentiment of like wanting to land somewhere in that area was definitely intentional. And that's kind of how the landing came to be. I think the process of writing is absolutely also a practice of self-love, because I think there are ways that, at least for me, writing kind of magnifies a lot of my fears about just like also being human. The fear of failure, right? Like that's something that doesn't just exist on the page, that doesn't exist sort of in my writing life. Like the fear of failure touches everything, right? And there's a way that I think we have to learn to be gentler with ourselves. There's a way that I think we have to learn to be more forgiving, that we have to learn to be kind. And I think practicing that in my writing process, by extension, I think I started to learn how to do that in other areas of my life as well. I think also just having the space to catalog kind of everything I went through, and getting to end on a note of like, I learned some things, and I'm still learning, and being able to extend that grace to myself, I think was really freeing and also just a really empowering experience. And I think I'll always be learning. I think I'll always be in a state of learning more about love, what it looks like, what it means. Because I think love is also always changing shape, and I think that's one of the most beautiful and wonderful things about it.
Thank you for that. I knew that was going to be like, which I just want to name that as you were talking about treating yourself gently, treating yourself kind, the poem that a cut foot teaches me kindness comes to mind, because that poem truly speaks to that gentleness, that tenderness, that act of like self-love. Would you mind reading that?
I would love to read that.
Yeah.
And also one of the later poems of this book, surprise, surprise. A cut foot teaches kindness. I cradled my foot like an infant's in my grip. A red-lipped kisser daggered into its soul in glass still rooted in flesh. A crystal wing tipped to tweeze loose, gently, slowly. It makes a hole too deep to dam with pressure. My t-shirt's hem pressed to the wound, a poor man's gauze soaked through. Last week, I called my mother on a whim and asked her how she dealt with loneliness. You learn to take care of yourself, become your own Prince Charming. So I extract the shard like a lover might, ask myself, does it hurt? You all right? Along the way. I'd kiss it if I could reach. I'd cover it with my lips and say, there, there. If healing was as easy as this, I could get used to the feeling.
I think that's my second favorite poem in the book. Not gonna lie, I read that, I almost cried. I think I did cry. It's such a good poem. So I wanna briefly take a detour back to this concept of home, just for a moment. Because I'm obsessed with a home.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to be home? What does it mean to find home? I'm specifically obsessed from the perspective of exile, right? And the ways in which we have been exiled. So like relationally from each other and stranger danger, all these things.
Yeah.
And just like exiled from our cultures, exiled from the land and our lands, and also exiled from ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, one, do you identify, like, have you ever felt like an exile? One, and then two, because this whole book is about coming home, and for me, your title speaks to some level of exasperation of clicking one's heels and and having not possibly yet arrived. But like, what is home like to you, right?
Yeah, I think, ever since I left Chicago, sort of feeling like I belonged again was a sort of never-ending, just relentless process. I don't think I ever fully felt at home in Birmingham. Mind you, I was in Birmingham also during like the 2016 election as well, which was a very particular experience. But I think, my first chapter, Bloodworm, is a really kind of deep dive into thinking about like geography and how geography like influences, my everyday experience as a Black woman. And I think there are ways that, geographically in particular, Black women are kind of constantly exiled. And so I think being away from my physical home, part of my everyday sort of process of survival was like finding ways to create home on the go. Like, what does creating home look like when it can't necessarily be attached to a physical place? And so I think some of the exasperation with I Done Clicked My Heels 3 times, the title, is just like, I want to belong. Like I'm here in Birmingham and I don't feel like I belong. I'm here in Cincinnati and I'm closer, but it's still not quite right. But also when she clicks her heels 3 times, she recognizes that she's had the power to go home the entire time. Like she's been looking for this magical whiz who somehow like has the answers and has the power to do it. And it's been inside of her all along. And I think that was also a realization of like, home has to be here first. Yeah. And sometimes home is only here. Like there are going to be some places in my life, or maybe some places that I live, or places that I'm, visiting or whatever, that I don't feel like I belong, and I am an exile, but home has to be here always first. And I think that was a part of the journey of writing the book and being in the world as well.
One, thank you for that response. Two, I feel like we're in tandem, like we're just like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So then, I'll ask this question and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
What advice would you give to a poet like myself, maybe, who's constructing and putting together their first collection, their first full length?
Yeah, I think one thing is you have ideas about, I'm sure you have ideas already about what this project is supposed to be. The poems always know more than you do. And I think giving yourself the permission to let the poems tell you what they need, and maybe letting go a little bit, which I know is hard. I know it's hard. But sometimes letting go of what you think the book has to be. I'm editing my second book right now, and it was one way when we sold it, and now we started editing it, and I just, in the past month or so, I went to my editor and I was like, how would you feel if we switched out 20 of these poems? And I think that's happened because I'm in a place, I'm out of my program now. There's nobody's voice in my head but mine. Yeah. And I've just been kind of I've felt the freedom to just kind of give myself over to the poems. And surprise, surprise, the poems that I'm producing are, I think, the poems that actually really need to be in the book. I had an idea about what the project was, and then here come these poems that are actually, this is really what you're trying to say. And I think it requires a certain level of letting go. So give yourself over to the poems because they always know more than you do.
Come on. Come on. Okay, all right. Note taken. I'll receive. Are there any questions from the audience?
You have a question, you have to come up to a mic, please, so that our audience at home can hear what you have to say. And if there is anyone at home with a question listening right now, please put your questions in chat, and I'd be glad to read them.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much. Your poems are beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
And loving, which brings me to the question. I have a young adult nephew who was born, raised, went away, but came back to Chicago and sees it as one of the most racist cities that he's ever seen. But I didn't see any of that in your poems. Did you experience any of that when you were in Chicago? Racism?
I mean, I think, yes. But I think also where I grew up, I was just surrounded by Black people. My communities were just so heavily populated with people who looked like me that
It's South Side?
Yes, it is.
Oh, that's where.
Yes,
that's where
yes,
he.
ma'am. And so
Emerald Avenue is where he grew up.
66 in St. Lawrence for me. Yeah. And so I think when remembering those early days in particular, those were the experiences of just being so steeped in a community in which there were just people who looked like me. Of course, especially as I've returned as an adult, I've had those experiences, but I think the poems that are, more steeped in Chicago and in the actual South Side are more from the perspective of a child, a younger version of me. And I think also, I think this book was more concerned about the community and the love than it was kind of those experiences too.
Those are exactly the kind of books we need, community and love.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I bought the Kindle for $12.99 and I read it all afternoon. It's wonderful, it's amazing.
Thank
and
you.
to quote Emily Dickinson, the top of my head felt like it had been taken off. I knew it was poetry. Every poem is an A. I have a question about your publisher, Soft Skull.
Yeah.
Do they only accept submitted by agent poetry collections?
I believe they have an open submission period at some point. They do, yes.
That's open without an agent?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're so welcome.
And to the lady that first spoke, I mean, there's racism everywhere, but there's love everywhere too. So, I mean, it's just, hey, it's good. But my question was initially to ask you if this book would be appropriate for a sixth grade girl, because I really want to encourage her to just think about who she is and where she fits and all of that. Of course, after I heard you read, I'm not sure it is. So what's your answer?
Yeah, there's some profanity, and there are some poems that I do think kind of explore some eroticism, so maybe wait till high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah? I don't want to get in trouble. I want to get email.
We're not trying to have bad books out.
Gotta keep it real now.
Good evening,
Hi.
all. I just want to say, Taylor, I love your poetry. It's I was in awe when I read it. Melissa, I just started following you about 2 months ago. Your poetry is riveting as well, and sometimes I read it when I kind of want to glean inspiration for my own poetry. And I do have a question, Taylor. So,
Yeah.
my name is Taylor too. I don't know if I just
hey,
said
other Taylor.
But so how did you like overcome like feelings, if you had any, of like unworthiness, or any kind of self-doubt, like when you entered the contest, the Maya Angelou book award contest, or just when you thought about like publishing your book?
Yeah, I think being in the industry in a few different places helps. I'm now really fortunate enough to like edit for a few publications too, and I think one thing that you learn is so much of what happens in the industry when it comes down to publication, awards, so much of it has nothing to do with you and the quality of your work. And so much of it has to just be, it's about like being in the right place at the right time, having submitted it when, it was in the hands of someone who like could really appreciate it. And I think that really helps to take the pressure off a lot of the times. So much of this is subjective, like we all have our different tastes, right? The people that are supposed to find your work are going to find it. And I think I was also thinking about, and I think this happens in any industry, but there are always people who are like just leading with audacity and audacity alone. And like, they're just like, I deserve to be here. And so they are. And like sometimes are not qualified to be there, right? But I think when you think about that, like just leading with audacity, like that's just really helpful, I think, in thinking about like some people just are just audacity their way into the room. And so therefore I feel like I can do the same. But of course make sure that work is good. But like I think thinking about that as well is like some people just kind of lead with that attitude of I deserve to be here and so I am. And I think just adopting that, in particular as a Black woman, has been, I think, very important to me.
That was really helpful. Thank you both.
Of course, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I love y'all's like unintentional matching.
We said the same thing. Yes.
I have two questions. One for you, Taylor, and then one for both of you.
Yes.
I would call myself like a novice poetry reader, but I'm trying to like intentionally make that part of my reading practice.
Yes.
And I've noticed Chicago poets love Chicago, especially like two that I'm pretty familiar with are like Eve Ewing and Nate Marshall.
Fantastic ones.
And so I'm curious, like, if you consider yourself a Chicago poet and like how Chicago has just like influenced your writing life, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then the question for both of you is like, how do you organize your collections? Like you kind of talked about that a little bit tonight, but like, how do you build a collection? How do you decide how to order things?
Yeah. I can start first. Yes, I definitely consider myself a Chicago poet. One, because, of my love for Chicago, and I think Chicago is going to follow me everywhere I go. It's going to, show up in my work even when I'm not thinking about it. But I think there's also just a tradition in particular, and of course I'm biased, no pun intended. But I think Chicago poets, there's something about Chicago poets, and maybe it's because we're from Chicago, and I think Chicago is a very particular and special place. To me, there's something about the way that Chicago poets can see the world and can write about the world that's really special to me. And I hope that I always sort of stay in that lineage and continue to like write into that lineage of just being a very careful and intentional observer of the world in the way that I think Chicago poets are. So organizing a collection. Organizing a collection, at least for me, has required me to kill my ego and allow people to tell me no, and that sucks. It's not fun. But I think you're writing the poems, you have ideas, right? You know like how they're connected in some ways, but the work is also right here, and you just cannot see it in its entirety because it's so close. You need somebody to come and pull you by your shoulders and pull you back so you can kind of see it fully. And so I think when it comes time to organize a book, invite someone that you trust, someone that kind of knows who you are as a writer into that space to kind of help you see the full range of what the project is. And I think also allow for those themes that you have, like, to be very broad as well. I think we also often have these very particular ways that we see things being connected, and sometimes we need to broaden our ideas about what that looks like. Like, one of the things is like a home, but if I only was thinking about home in terms of Chicago or my very specific neighborhood in Chicago, that book would not have existed. So I think allowing yourself or allowing those themes and definitions to kind of exist in a larger way would be really helpful as you organize that book.
Yeah, so everything Taylor said, listen to Taylor. I will add that for my chapbook, I definitely, so I didn't have a second pair of eyes on my chapbook, which makes me deeply insecure these days, but.
Chapbook is different too.
Yeah.
It's like very focused.
It's a chapbook is a very focused, thematic text that's smaller than a full length. And it's a journey. So like the way I organize a chapbook is like literally the poems take you on a desired beginning, middle, end kind of thing. And that's how I organize that now. And the collection that I'm organizing now, it's a lot of exploration, a lot of surrender, a lot of like feeling into what poems feel like they're talking to each other. A mentor of mine told me, one of my things is I have a tendency to be on level 10 at all times, both in my poems and in my life. A mentor once told me, and hopefully this is helpful to you, that a collection of poems isn't your greatest hits. So it's like allowing your poems to oscillate, right? To have some of those like hard, heavy, your favorite poems in there. And then some poems that you're like, this isn't my favorite, but it's a poem, right? And it connects to the theme, because what you don't know is what's gonna actually really talk to someone else. And like the
poems that you're not even excited about.
Yeah, exactly.
They're like, oh my God, that was mine. You're like, I don't even know. That's in there, that book. Yeah, that made it in. Yep.
Yep. And so just like, yes, have that second pair of eyes. Always have that second pair of eyes. And two, give yourself some space to put some stuff in there that you wouldn't necessarily consider even putting in there if it's tied together. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
As someone who put out my first collection in 2022, thank you, and feels stirring to do something else but has no idea what that could be, since you're editing your second book, what advice would you give when trying to figure out what a second book could be about or around, or like how did you narrow a focus?
I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't.
Okay.
I finished the first book and I just kept writing. I think what happens, and also I started reading different things too. And my reading always changes sort of the speed and the pace by which my writing evolves. And so I think changing what you're reading is going to be really helpful. But I don't think you have to concern yourself with I need to figure out what this focus is. A lot of times that happens much later, you know. It definitely did for me. I didn't click my heels 3 times. When I was writing most of those poems, I didn't know I was writing a book. I wasn't thinking about the ways that they were connected. I wasn't writing towards a project. And I think a lot of times it happens organically in that way. Like, you're just writing what feels important. Sometimes you'll find yourself writing what feels like the same things in your first book, and you'll kind of get in your head about that. But give yourself the permission to do that, because I hate to be the one to break it to us, but we are all writing about the same things through different lenses, in different ways. And you know, most of the times it's because it's things that, you know, characterize and make us who we are. We're just finding sort of different ways to think about them. So don't worry about narrowing it down right now. Write what feels important, and you're gonna look up in a little bit and you're gonna see how they've been talking to each other, and that's how it's probably gonna happen. Yeah, you're welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm curious, what or who led you to poetry for both of you? Where'd that come from?
So I knew that I wanted to be a writer when I was in high school and I had my journals. And you know, you ever realize that you're like doing too much? I was like writing my journal entries and I was like doing too much in my journal entries. And I was like, oh, I think I want to do something more than just this. And so I went into undergrad. I was actually a fiction writer first. I was writing my short stories. I was like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, get out of here and write a novel. This is what I'm gonna do. And at the end of undergrad, I took an ekphrastic poetry class, which is a poetry class, you know, we were writing poems inspired by visual art. Completely changed my life, completely changed my trajectory. I switched over to poetry after that and have not looked back. And then I started to get into Patricia Smith, who was like one of my all-time favorites and probably will always be. And then a wonderful Black woman poet named Erica Dawson came to campus. And, you know, I just kind of been getting into contemporary, you know, poets. But still all of my life, the poets that were taught to me were poets who were either no longer living or poets who were writing about things I couldn't really relate to. And then here was this Black woman. It was really funny because I had to introduce her. I'm 5'1", she's like 6 feet tall. It was great. And this is this woman doing the thing that I want to do, but I just didn't know was necessarily possible, or didn't know that people were doing, people that looked like me in particular. And her being there was all the permission that I needed to go after the thing. So it was her just coming to campus, reading her poems. She also loves form. She completely changed my life and is a big, big, big part of why I'm here.
For me, in 7th grade, I went through some really hard stuff. My sister had committed suicide, and I was like very alone. And I was also simultaneously very obsessed with helping people. I was always like, how am I gonna help people? And then I was sitting at my desk and we were assigned a poem, Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. Mm-hmm. And I had already like done therapy. The kids were not nice. My family was dealing with the death in their own way. And so I had nowhere to turn. And then I looked on this page and those words reached into me and started to lift me from within. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is poetry, and this is what poetry can do. And this is a real material way to help people that I feel called to. So that was like the first step. It was like, I'm gonna be a poet in 7th grade. In 10th grade, I got really mad at somebody. It was my niece's stepfather, or my niece's father, because he was a very like bigoted man. And so I wrote this poem about racism and about like unity and things like this. And I was very angry, and I turned it into a teacher. And the teacher was like, in order to join the poetry club, and the teacher was like, this is a spoken word poem, and I had never heard of spoken word. And that's how I stumbled upon spoken word. And then the third part was actually E.E. Cummings. I was reading this poem, Anyone Lived in a Pretty House Town, and I love mystery. I love like uncovering what's under the layers, and E.E. Cummings was a poem, or Anyone Lived in a Pretty House Town was a poem that continued to like serve still to like years and years later still serves like new discoveries. And that's when I decided that I was going to study poetry for the rest of my life. So I would say those three things, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you, Dr. Byas and Ms. Ferrer Civil.
Yeah.